A corrupt judge is bribed with money and falsely accuses a pregnant and widowed woman. However, on the day of the trial, a millionaire shocks everyone with what he says. Amanda Sullivan, 29 years old, had once believed that her life had finally found its rhythm. Living in a modest two-bedroom house in Charleston, South Carolina, she and her husband David had shared quiet evenings, hopeful plans, and a future filled with dreams. But that future was shattered 3 months ago on a rainy Thursday evening, when David never returned from a charity event. A head-on collision on the highway ended his life in an instant, leaving Amanda alone, 7 months pregnant, and drowning in a grief that seemed too heavy for her slim frame to carry. Charleston, with its cobblestone streets and southern charm, had become a place of whispers and stares. The locals, who once smiled kindly at her across the pharmacy counter, now only offered silence or pitiful glances. She worked part-time at a neighborhood pharmacy, not out of choice, but necessity. The salary barely covered her bills, and every night she would sit on the worn living room couch, sorting through unpaid invoices and wondering how she'd manage when the baby came. David had been a coordinator at a local non-profit, the Carolina Hope Initiative, which supported families in economic crisis. He loved his work, believing deeply in community and compassion. Amanda often helped out at events, manning registration tables or handing out flyers, always proud to stand by his side. But since his death, the organization had distanced itself from her. No phone calls, no condolences, nothing. Now each morning was a battle. Amanda would wake up early, her back aching from the weight of the pregnancy and the stress that never let up. She'd press a trembling hand to her belly, whisper something reassuring to the baby growing inside her, and push through another day. The house was too quiet, the silence only broken by the occasional flutter of a kick or the rustle of wind against the shutters. She still kept David's side of the closet untouched, his shoes lined up neatly, his favorite blue sweater folded on the top shelf. Sometimes she'd bury her face in it, inhaling the fading scent of cedarwood and old cologne. The grief didn't just live in her chest, it haunted the walls, settled into the corners of every room. What hurt the most wasn't just losing David, it was the loneliness that followed. Friends disappeared, unsure how to comfort her. Neighbors avoided conversation. Even the cashier at the grocery store had stopped making small talk. Amanda felt like a ghost in her own life, floating through days that didn't seem real. But worse than the silence was the letter. It had arrived 2 days ago, slipped between a coupon catalog and a credit card bill. A formal letter printed on heavy cream paper. The envelope bore the logo of the Department of Justice. Inside, black ink danced across the page, spelling out, "A nightmare." Amanda Sullivan was under investigation for financial misconduct involving the Carolina Hope Initiative. She had read the letter 5 times, her eyes blurring with disbelief. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The words didn't belong to her. She was a pharmacy clerk, a widow, a soon-to-be mother. How could anyone think she had stolen from the organization that David had poured his life into? At first she laughed, a bitter, disbelieving sound. Then she cried until her throat hurt. She called the contact number on the letter, but was told to wait for further instructions. No explanations, no clarifications, just the echoing weight of the accusation hanging over her like a storm cloud. Amanda had no lawyer, no savings, no allies, only questions. What was happening? Why her? And what did they hope to find in the wreckage of a life already broken? She folded the letter neatly and placed it on the kitchen counter. The baby kicked again, as if responding to her rising heartbeat. Amanda closed her eyes and whispered, "It's going to be okay." Though she no longer believed it. She couldn't afford to collapse, not now. Not when her child needed her. Not when the world seemed so determined to take everything she had left. But deep down, something darker stirred. Something she wasn't ready to name. A suspicion that maybe David's accident wasn't so accidental, and that this accusation wasn't a mistake at all, just the beginning. The sound of the pharmacy's front bell echoed through the quiet store. A flat chime that usually meant another customer looking for aspirin or allergy pills. Amanda wiped her hands on her apron and straightened her posture. She had barely slept. The night before, tormented by dreams that twisted reality into something unrecognizable. That morning she had nearly decided not to come to work at all, but staying home felt worse. There, the silence screamed. The pharmacy was dimly lit, the old fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Amanda's shift had only just begun when she saw two figures walking through the glass door. Both men wore dark suits, their expressions unreadable. They didn't move like customers. Their eyes scanned the room, locked on her, and advanced with purpose. Amanda's heart quickened. Something about them felt wrong. "Are you Amanda Sullivan?" the taller man asked as they reached the counter. He produced a badge from inside his blazer, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Amanda blinked, her mind scrambling. "Yes, is there a problem?" "I'm Agent Travis Monroe, and this is Agent Lisa Herrera. We have a warrant for your arrest issued by the United States District Court of South Carolina." What are you talking about?" The shorter agent, a woman with tightly coiled dark hair and sharp eyes, handed Amanda a stack of papers. "You are being charged with wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent." The words swirled around Amanda like smoke, suffocating, unbelievable. Her ears buzzed as she glanced around, noticing customers and co-workers frozen in place, staring. Her boss, Mr. Dennison, stood in the doorway to the back office, his face pale. One of the customers, a middle-aged woman Amanda recognized from church, let out a small gasp. "I didn't do anything," Amanda said, her voice shaking. "This has to be a mistake." "We'll discuss that at the station," Agent Monroe replied. "Please step out from behind the counter." Her legs felt like concrete. Her belly, already taut and heavy, seemed to double in weight. Amanda moved slowly, not out of defiance, but because her body simply refused to obey the madness unfolding around her. One of the agents gently took her by the elbow and guided her outside, while the other walked behind. Charleston's heat wrapped around her like a blanket, but Amanda felt cold. The news vans weren't there yet. This was still private. But she knew the whispers would begin as soon as the door shut behind her. She had no idea how quickly they would spread. At the precinct, Amanda was fingerprinted and processed like a common criminal. Her mugshot was taken, her belongings placed in a plastic bin. The baby kicked wildly inside her, as if protesting the stress. A kind-eyed female officer brought her water and let her sit in a separate holding area, away from the general population, citing her pregnancy. Hours passed. A public defender was assigned, a young man named Derek Langley with soft features and a tie that looked borrowed. He barely met her eyes as he explained the charges. Amanda was accused of embezzling over $180,000 from the Carolina Hope Initiative over the past 18 months. Documents, bank transfers, and forged signatures linked her name directly to illicit financial activity. "I didn't do any of that," Amanda said, the desperation in her voice growing. "I wouldn't even know how." Langley shifted uncomfortably. "There are signed authorizations, emails from your account, and a series of wire transfers to a bank account in your name. They're building a very strong case. My husband worked there, maybe. Maybe someone used his access." He shook his head. "David Sullivan's access was terminated after his death. All suspicious activity began before that." Amanda froze. "But that doesn't make sense. David would never, he didn't." Langley held up a hand. "I'm not saying he did, but they believe you were involved. They claim you continued the operation after his passing, perhaps even to cover your tracks." The room tilted slightly. Amanda gripped the table's edge to steady herself. "This is insane. I'm pregnant. I work at a pharmacy. I don't even know how to move that kind of money." Langley softened. "Look, this is what I can do. There's a plea deal on the table. 5 years in prison reduced to 3 with good behavior. You'd be eligible for early release in less than 2. Amanda's heart nearly stopped. "You want me to admit guilt for something I didn't do? Leave my baby behind. It's safer than going to trial, especially with the judge assigned to your case." Amanda looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Langley hesitated, then leaned in. "Leonard Campbell, federal judge. He's known for being unyielding. His conviction rate is nearly perfect. He doesn't tolerate emotional appeals. If you take this to court and he doesn't believe you, you're looking at 20 years, minimum. Amanda recoiled, her eyes burning with tears. I can't. I won't. I didn't do this. Langley exhaled through his nose. Then we start preparing for trial. That night, Amanda was released on bail, thanks to a kind neighbor who offered her property as collateral. But the damage had already begun. As she walked out of the precinct, flashes from local news cameras blinded her. The headline was already circulating, "Pregnant widow accused of defrauding local charity." The media loved the irony. The woman once seen as a grieving victim, now recast as a conniving thief. Back home, Amanda found the windows of her house egged. Someone had spray-painted "liar" on her fence. The mailbox was stuffed with hate mail, and several deliveries had been cancelled. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't dare open. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the nursery, still half-decorated with pale yellow walls and unopened boxes of baby clothes, and held her stomach, whispering promises through choked sobs. She couldn't afford to break, not now. But in the pit of her stomach, Amanda knew she was being targeted, and if she was going to survive, she would have to fight harder than she ever thought possible, even if she had to do it alone. Se estiver tudo certo com esta parte, sigo para a parte 3, the judge who turns victims into criminals. Judge Leonard Campbell arrived at the courthouse every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, escorted by a black town car and flanked by 2 private security guards. Though officially protected only during high-profile cases, Leonard insisted on the extra precautions year-round. He claimed it was due to the unpredictable temperament of the public, but in truth, the judge feared something far more specific: retribution. To the outside world, Judge Campbell was a symbol of incorruptible authority. Appointed to the bench 10 years ago, he had risen quickly through the ranks of the federal judiciary, known for his sharp mind, unshakable demeanor, and swift decisions. He presided over criminal trials with a rigid sense of order, his gavel striking like thunder, his eyes betraying no emotion. In court, he was feared by attorneys and defendants alike. Prosecutors called him a sure bet. Defense teams called him a death sentence. But Leonard Campbell's robes hid more than a stern sense of justice. Beneath the surface of his judicial image lay a network of secrets, forged in silence and protected by bribes. Over the past 7 years, Campbell had become entangled in a web of corruption involving businessmen, political donors, and financial opportunists. The arrangement was simple: deliver the desired verdicts, and in return money would appear in offshore accounts, renovations would be paid in cash, and connections would be rewarded with influence. No one ever questioned him. No one dared. One of his most profitable alliances was with Richard Alden, a name whispered in Charleston's elite circles, with a mix of admiration and fear. Alden had built an empire on real estate, private investments, and silent partnerships in seemingly charitable organizations. The Carolina Hope Initiative was one of his latest ventures, a front to launder money under the guise of philanthropy. David Sullivan, Amanda's late husband, had become inconveniently curious about the discrepancies in the nonprofit's accounts, and although his death was officially ruled an accident, Alden had ensured that no investigation would ever follow. Amanda Sullivan, however, was never meant to become a problem. She was supposed to fade into obscurity, consumed by grief and the burdens of motherhood. But her refusal to disappear presented a complication. She had to be discredited, publicly and permanently. It was Richard Alden who suggested she be framed for the missing funds, and it was Judge Campbell who agreed to oversee the case, quietly ensuring that no amount of truth would save her. In chambers, Campbell reviewed Amanda's case file with mild detachment. He scanned the indictment documents, the fabricated email logs, the doctored bank statements, and the formal testimonies from members of the nonprofit, all carefully curated. To paint Amanda as a cunning manipulator, he knew the evidence was fraudulent. He didn't care. "Open and shut," he muttered, tapping a pen against his legal pad. "Let's get this done quickly." His clerk, Melanie, glanced up from her laptop. Her public defender filed a motion to dismiss some of the charges, citing lack of material evidence. Campbell snorted. Denied she's going to trial. She's pregnant, Melanie added carefully. 7 months. Campbell didn't lift his eyes. Then we'll expedite. Amanda Sullivan's court date was scheduled just 3 weeks from her arrest, giving the defense no time to prepare. Langley, her attorney, filed repeated motions for discovery, requests for evidence and appeals for delay, all denied by Campbell with one-word responses. In the courthouse halls, whispers grew. Some attorneys had begun to notice a pattern in Campbell's rulings, a disturbing consistency in cases involving corporate plaintiffs and vulnerable defendants. Over the years, low-income individuals, immigrants, and whistleblowers had all fallen victim to his court. No amount of logic or law seemed to sway his judgment. When Judge Campbell made up his mind, the verdict was merely a formality. But Leonard didn't worry about perception. He worried only about control. Behind his polished desk at home, he kept a ledger, not a digital file, but a handwritten log bound in black leather, hidden beneath the floorboards of his study. Each entry was coded, using nicknames and numerical references that only he and Alden could decipher: dates of meetings, dollar amounts, locations of transactions, names of intermediaries. Amanda's name was there too, under the entry marked Sullivan Transfer Protocol. He had grown accustomed to the ritual. Every few months, Alden would host a discreet dinner at his private club, a place where cell phones were banned, and the wine list included vintages older than most of the guests. There, surrounded by oil paintings and velvet drapes, the two men would discuss new targets, exchange favors, and laugh at the incompetence of those beneath them. At their last meeting, Alden had brought up Amanda's resistance. "She's digging," he said, swirling a glass of Merlot. "Even pregnant, she's asking too many questions. If she gets too close to David's notes..." Campbell waved a hand. "She won't get far. Her lawyer's a child. I'll crush the defense before it ever reaches the stand." "Make sure you do," Alden said coldly. "There's more riding on this than you know." Now, as the trial approached, Campbell began rehearsing his statements, crafting a narrative that would steer the jury without ever appearing biased. He would lean on Amanda's suspicious behavior, her inexplicable financial connections, her access to confidential data. He'd hint at the tragic death of her husband as a potential trigger for irrational decisions. And when the time came, he would deliver a sentence that made her an example. The press, already hungry for scandal, would eat it up. As he sat back in his leather chair, sipping from a crystal tumbler of scotch, Campbell stared at the photograph on his desk, one of him shaking hands with a senator during a campaign fundraiser. His eyes were hard, cold. Justice to him was not blind. It was bound in chains of power and profit, manipulated by those who understood the rules of the game. Amanda Sullivan didn't understand those rules, but she was about to learn. And, unless something drastic happened, she would pay the price for truths no one wanted uncovered, even if it cost her everything. Amanda Sullivan had never felt as isolated as she did in the days following her arrest. The home she once shared with David felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. Each room echoed with memories that brought no comfort, only pain. A toothbrush still in its holder, a half-filled coffee mug forgotten behind a cabinet, a note from David scribbled on a grocery list. Everything seemed frozen in the moment before. Her life had unraveled, and now, surrounded by that past, Amanda faced a future that threatened to strip her of everything else she had left. She had hoped, naively perhaps, that someone would come forward to defend her. Someone from David's world, the non-profit community he had committed himself to, the colleagues he had once spoken so highly of, the friends who had attended their baby shower, toasted to their anniversary, and left sympathetic messages after the crash. But days passed, then a full week, and the silence became deafening. Amanda began with Margaret Jensen, the executive director of the Carolina Hope Initiative, a dignified woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and a permanent look of composed concern. Margaret had always spoken warmly of David. Amanda had seen her at the funeral, standing near the back, eyes brimming with what Amanda then thought was genuine sadness. If anyone would help her clear her name, Amanda believed it would be her. She called the office first. A receptionist answered, curt and professional, and informed her that Ms. Jensen was unavailable for the foreseeable future. Amanda persisted, explaining who she was and why she needed to speak with Margaret. After a long silence, the receptionist relented and scheduled a 10-minute meeting at the organization's headquarters on the condition that Amanda not bring legal representation or media contacts. When she arrived, she was made to wait in the lobby for 20 minutes past the scheduled time. The non-profit's walls were lined with framed photographs of smiling families, community events, and glossy certificates of recognition. Amanda stared. At them, her stomach churning with both nausea and fury. These were the lives David had fought to improve, and now his name was being twisted into something criminal. Margaret finally appeared, wearing a navy blazer and an expression that suggested the conversation was already over. "Amanda," she said with a tight smile, "I didn't expect you so soon." "I came because I need your help," Amanda said, trying to stay composed. "You knew David. You knew he was honest. I'm being accused of something I didn't do. I need someone, anyone, who worked with him to speak out." Margaret's smile faltered. She gestured toward a nearby office and closed the door behind them. "Look, I understand this is difficult, but the situation has become delicate. There are documents, emails, records. From the outside, the case looks solid. But you know better," Amanda insisted. "You know David wouldn't have touched that money. You know I never had access to anything. Why is no one saying that?" Margaret lowered her voice. "Because saying that would require us to publicly contradict the findings of a federal investigation. It would put the entire organization under scrutiny. We'd lose donors, programs would collapse. I have people depending on me." "So you're protecting the non-profit's image over the truth?" Amanda asked, voice rising. "I'm protecting what we've built," Margaret said coldly. "I'm sorry for what you're going through, truly. But if you want my advice, take the plea deal. A few years in prison is better than fighting a case you can't win." Amanda stood, her chair scraping the floor. Her fists trembled at her sides. "You're a coward." Margaret didn't respond. She opened the door and stepped aside, signaling the meeting was over. Amanda walked out without another word. She didn't stop there. She reached out to every name she could remember from David's contact list. His old co-worker Kyle refused to meet in person and hung up the moment she mentioned the charges. Tanya, who had once organized events with David, said she wasn't comfortable getting involved. Even a man David had mentored, a young accountant named Jeremy, claimed he had no memory of anything suspicious and suggested she move on. Each rejection felt like another betrayal. Amanda had expected resistance, maybe doubt, but not this, an orchestrated collective withdrawal. It wasn't just fear, it was coordination, the kind of silence that didn't come naturally but was requested, demanded, purchased. She started noticing changes around her as well. Her neighbors avoided eye contact. The woman who used to bring over fresh cornbread on Sundays stopped waving when Amanda stepped outside. At the grocery store, people whispered and shifted to different aisles. At the pharmacy, Mr. Dennison gave her fewer shifts, until finally he asked her not to return until things settled down. Her only company during those long days was the sound of the wind outside and the distant hum of her baby monitor. She spent hours sitting on the nursery floor, surrounded by unopened boxes and half-finished decorations. The baby kicked more frequently now, responding to her rising stress, her deepening despair. One evening, desperate for something, anything, Amanda logged into David's old laptop, which she had kept stored away after his funeral. It took her 3 tries to guess the password, but finally the screen came to life. She scoured his files, looking for names, notes, evidence, anything that might explain what he had been working on, and buried deep in a folder labeled Event. Budgets. She found something strange, a spreadsheet that didn't match any of the official event records she remembered. It listed large donation amounts, followed by odd expenses with vague descriptions, consulting services, resource transfers, project assistance. Next to each line was a name, R. Alden. She didn't know the name. She had never heard David mention anyone named Alden. But the amounts involved were huge, tens of thousands flowing through the organization under opaque justifications. And David had flagged several entries in yellow. Amanda's eyes narrowed. She knew now that her husband had seen something, had tried, in his own quiet way, to understand what was happening. But he never told her. Had he been afraid? Or had he hoped to resolve it quietly? Regardless, she had stumbled onto a clue, maybe even the beginning of the truth. And if no one else would help her, she would follow this lead herself. Because the silence of her allies was no longer just disappointing. It was dangerous, and she had no choice but to become louder than all of them combined. Amanda hadn't slept properly in days. The corners of her mind were darkened by exhaustion, grief, and rising fear, but her instincts told her she couldn't stop. Not now. She had gone too far to turn back. If she gave up, the narrative already being written about her would become permanent. She'd be remembered not as a grieving widow or an expectant mother, but as a liar and a thief. That reality was more terrifying than the idea of facing Judge Leonard Campbell in a courtroom. And so, at 2 o'clock in the morning, with the only light in the house coming from the pale glow of David's old laptop, Amanda kept digging. She opened every folder, every spreadsheet, every archived email, hunting for patterns. Some documents were old grant applications and funding proposals. Others were project schedules and staff assignments, but tucked away inside a folder labeled Year-End Review, she discovered a set of files she had never seen before. One in particular caught her attention, a scanned contract titled Financial Oversight Agreement. Her eyes moved slowly across the document. The contract was formal and filled with the dense legal language she barely understood. But what stood out was the signature page. 3 names were listed: Margaret Jensen as director of the Carolina Hope Initiative, David Sullivan as project manager, and one more, Richard Alden, listed as external financial consultant. The name triggered something in her. She'd seen it once before, briefly mentioned in a spreadsheet attached to one of the reports she had reviewed days ago, a report she hadn't paid close attention to at the time. Now it stood out like a wound. Amanda opened her notebook, the one she had been using to track every confusing twist of this nightmare. She flipped back through the pages, found the spreadsheet printout, and there it was, line item number 14. Our transfer of $25,000 labeled Consulting Fee R. Alden. Her heart pounded faster. She had never met anyone named Richard Alden, never heard David mention him. He wasn't part of the regular staff, nor had he ever appeared at the events Amanda helped organize. So why was he signing documents and receiving large sums of money from the same organization now accusing her of theft? The next morning, Amanda called a friend of David's from college, Corey Hanley, a freelance tech consultant who had helped David build the Carolina Hope Initiative's website years ago. Corey hadn't returned her earlier messages, but this time she didn't leave a voicemail. She kept calling until he picked up. "I don't want any trouble, Amanda," he said quickly. "I heard about everything. I'm sorry, but I'm not calling for sympathy," she interrupted. "I need a name. Richard Alden. Do you know him?" There was a pause on the line, just long enough to confirm that Corey did. "He worked with the board for a while," he finally said. "Did some kind of financial restructuring a couple years ago. Private guy. No one really talked to him." "Did David ever mention him?" Another pause. "He said Alden didn't like questions, that's all." Amanda scribbled the notes in the margin of her notebook. "Do you know where I can find him?" "No," Corey replied quickly. "And even if I did, I wouldn't get involved. Amanda, you don't know who you're dealing with. People like him. They don't leave footprints and they don't forgive." She ended the call with a cold feeling in her chest. Corey's fear confirmed what she already suspected. This Alden wasn't just some consultant. He was connected, powerful, and very much at the center of whatever had gone wrong inside the non-profit. Later that day, Amanda walked into the county records office. The building was quiet, nearly empty, with an older clerk at the front desk who gave her a tired smile. She requested access to public financial disclosures and tax filings for registered consultants associated with non-profit entities over the last 5 years. The clerk gave her a curious look. "That's a lot of paperwork." "I don't mind waiting," Amanda replied. "I have time." She didn't have time, of course. The baby was coming soon and the trial even sooner. But she couldn't afford to waste a second. With the help of the clerk, she sifted through file after file, until finally she found it, a disclosure report linking Richard Alden to no fewer than 8 different charitable organizations in the Charleston area. Each report listed his involvement, as short-term, always under 6 months, always with vague titles like consultant or strategist. Amanda leaned closer, analyzing the pattern. In every case, large sums of money appeared as consulting fees shortly before the non-profit underwent financial restructuring or quietly changed leadership. In 2 cases, the organizations dissolved entirely after Alden's tenure. He was a ghost moving through the walls of charity, siphoning money with no questions asked. Suddenly she understood. David must have discovered this pattern. And maybe he had tried to warn someone. Maybe he had even gathered evidence. But he never got the chance to act on it. Amanda's thoughts returned to the crash. How sudden, how clean it had seemed. She tried to shake the idea from her mind, but it clung to her like smoke. That night she went back to David's emails, now with fresh eyes. She searched for every message with the name Alden. There weren't many, just 2 short email threads. One was a forwarded message from Margaret, introducing Richard Alden to the board as a temporary consultant. The other was a draft David had never sent. It read, "Margaret, I reviewed Alden's projections. The numbers don't add up. I'm attaching a spreadsheet showing inconsistencies. We need to audit these immediately. I don't feel comfortable signing off on the next transfer until this is resolved. David." The spreadsheet was missing, but the email was enough. Amanda printed it, added it to her growing pile of evidence, and leaned back in her chair. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with the weight of all she was learning. She wasn't just a scapegoat. She was the final piece of a cover-up that had been years in the making. Richard Alden had orchestrated something large, something systemic, and now with David gone, Amanda was the last loose end. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The silence of others had forced her to find her own voice. And with each name, each document, each lie exposed, that voice was growing louder. She would not be erased, and she would not go quietly. The courthouse smelled of old wood and bleach, the kind of sterile atmosphere that felt indifferent to human suffering. Amanda sat quietly in the corridor, hands resting on her swollen belly, the documents she had collected clutched tightly in a folder against her chest. It was a preliminary hearing, not a full trial, just a procedural formality, but, to Amanda, it felt like stepping into a battlefield with nothing but paper as armor. Her name was called. She rose slowly, conscious of the weight pressing on her back and legs, the baby reminding her with every step that time was running out. She followed her attorney through the double doors into the courtroom, the walls towering around her like judgment itself. A few reporters lingered near the back. Margaret Jensen sat behind the prosecutor's table, lips pursed, eyes cold. Amanda avoided looking at her. Then she saw him. Richard Alden was seated in the gallery, not far from the front, dressed in a grey tailored suit that seemed to absorb the courtroom lights. He looked out of place not because of how he was dressed, but because of how comfortable he appeared, like a man watching a show he had seen before. His presence wasn't required. He wasn't a party in the case. And yet there he was, seated with quiet authority, like a shadow cast over the entire proceeding. Amanda had seen powerful men before, men who carried themselves like their will alone could bend reality. But Alden was different. His stillness was unnerving. His eyes tracked her with interest, but not empathy, more like he was studying an equation, calculating where the final variable might fall. There was no recognition in his gaze, no acknowledgement of her as a person, only a thin smile, too polite to be sincere. Amanda sat down beside Langley, who leaned toward her and whispered, "That's him, isn't it? The consultant you mentioned." "Yes," Amanda whispered back, her voice dry. "That's Richard Alden." Judge Campbell entered shortly after. The room stood, then sat in unison. Amanda noticed the moment Campbell's eyes found Alden. A flicker, barely perceptible, of unease passed over the judge's face. It vanished, quickly replaced by his usual mask of stern professionalism. But Amanda saw it, and it confirmed everything she feared. The hearing began. The prosecution presented a summary of the charges. reiterating the so-called evidence linking Amanda to the embezzlement scheme. The judge listened impassively, nodding occasionally, never interrupting. When Langley spoke, his voice was calm, but tentative. He requested the suppression of several pieces of evidence on grounds of improper authentication, but Campbell denied the motion without hesitation. Amanda watched as the game played out, every move predetermined. The judge barely looked in her direction. He addressed her only once to confirm her name and plea. She responded not guilty with a voice steadier than she expected. Then the judge declared a recess. As the room stirred and people stood, Amanda remained seated. Her gaze returned to Alden, who was already rising, straightening his cuffs. For a moment their eyes locked. This time he nodded at her, not as a greeting, more like a warning. She didn't know what came over her, but she stood, slowly, and walked toward him. Langley tried to stop her, but she brushed his hand away. "Mr. Alden," she said, her voice loud enough to turn a few heads. He paused, looking amused. "Mrs. Sullivan, I didn't expect to see you so soon." "You were David's consultant," she said. "You signed financial oversight contracts. You received payments, large ones, and now I'm the one being blamed for what you did." His expression didn't change. "That's a bold accusation." "It's the truth." "Careful," he said, still smiling. "Truth is a dangerous word in a courtroom. You don't always know whose truth is being told." Amanda stared at him, trying to gauge his limits, but there were none. Alden wasn't just confident, he was untouchable, or so he believed. "I found emails," she said, "drafts David never sent. He had questions about the money, about you." Alden's smile faded ever so slightly. David was a good man, idealistic. He didn't understand how things work. "He understood enough to be a threat," she replied. He leaned in, voice low. "David died in a car accident, a tragedy. Don't let your grief twist that into something worse." Amanda's throat tightened. The way he said it, too measured, too rehearsed, made her blood run cold. "If you think I'm afraid of you," she said, "you're wrong." "No," he said softly. "I think you're tired, alone, and very close to breaking. That's all I need." He turned and walked away, flanked by two men she hadn't noticed before, both dressed in the same bland corporate fashion. Security, associates, she didn't know. But she watched them leave and something inside her hardened. Later that evening, Amanda sat at home reviewing the documents again. She highlighted Alden's name in every file, cross-referenced dates, built a timeline. Each connection grew clearer. Transfers timed perfectly with Alden's visits, changes, in accounting practices that mirrored his recommendations. Signatures, some digital, some handwritten, all pointing to a man who never officially existed in the non-profit's public materials. She compiled everything into a new binder, labeled "Say it, Alden," and hid it under the nursery floorboards. It wasn't paranoia. Not anymore. It was strategy. She understood now that if she got too close to the truth, something might happen to her too. And she wasn't willing to let her child grow up in a world where Richard Alden walked free and untouchable. The next morning, Amanda received a letter in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words written in red ink. "Stop, or lose everything." She folded it once, slowly, and placed it in the same binder under the floor. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Amanda awoke to the sound of wind scratching against her bedroom window. It was still dark outside, the kind of early morning that blurs the line between night and dawn. Her body was sore, heavy with pregnancy, and the weight of relentless stress. Every muscle ached, but she forced herself to sit up. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now something else, no longer a wall in front of her, but a fire beneath her. She had reached a point where silence had become more dangerous than confrontation. Every unanswered question, every evasive glance from people who once claimed to care, had only sharpened her resolve. She moved carefully through the house, her breath fogging the window glass as she watched the street. Nothing unusual, no cars idling, no strangers watching. Still, she had learned not to dismiss her instincts. After Alden's thinly veiled threat, at the courthouse and the anonymous warning note, she knew she had stirred something. But she also knew she had no choice. If she didn't push forward, the story others were writing about her would become permanent. She opened David's laptop again, the keys now familiar under her fingertips. The files she had uncovered so far were damning but incomplete. She needed something definitive, something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. She retraced her steps, this time searching every folder for metadata, timestamps, digital footprints, draft histories, and in the middle of a folder labeled Annual Reports, she found something that didn't belong. A document titled dsullivanote.txt with no date stamp. It was just text, but the moment Amanda opened it, her heart stopped. It was a draft, unfinished, unpolished, just a stream of thoughts. But it was in David's voice. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep pretending everything is normal. The numbers are wrong. The signatures don't match. Transfers are being authorized without board approval, and I think Alden is behind it." I confronted Margaret, but she said it's not my place to ask questions. I made a copy of the ledgers. If anything happens to me, I didn't walk into traffic. I didn't fall asleep at the wheel. I didn't slip. I need someone to know that. Amanda's breath hitched. She read the message 3 times, then closed the laptop and sat in silence. The baby kicked, and she rested her hand over the movement, tears filling her eyes. David had seen it. He had felt the threat. And he had tried in his own quiet way to leave a trail. It wasn't evidence that could convict someone, not by itself, but it was enough to prove that David had been aware, that his death might not have been the accident everyone claimed. Amanda printed the file, added it to the growing binder, labeled Alden, and returned it to its hiding place beneath the floor. She couldn't take the risk of leaving it out, not now. Too many things were happening without explanation. Over the next few days, Amanda began reaching out to contacts outside the non-profit, former employees who had left under mysterious circumstances, vendors who had been paid late or not at all. She used false names to initiate email conversations, afraid her own would trigger immediate silence. Most never responded, but one did. He called himself Jonah. He refused to give a last name, but he agreed to meet in a public library in a neighboring town. Amanda drove there alone, one hand on the steering wheel, the other occasionally pressed to her belly to soothe the baby when it kicked too hard. She arrived early and waited in a corner of the reading room, pretending to browse a copy of the local newspaper. A man in his late 30s approached her, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't introduce himself. He just sat down and slid a flash drive across the table. "I used to work for Alden," he said, barely above a whisper. "Back when he was running similar schemes in Raleigh. I got out before it collapsed, but not before I saw what he was capable of. I've been watching the news. I saw your face." Amanda stared at the flash drive. "What's on it? Emails, recordings, some internal memos. You won't find his name on everything, but you'll know it's him. And there's one audio file. You'll want to listen to that one first." "Why help me?" she asked. Jonah's mouth twitched into something like a smile. "Because he ruined lives, and because someone finally stood up to him. Just be careful. He doesn't play fair." He left without another word. Amanda returned home and locked every door behind her. She plugged the flash drive into an old laptop that wasn't connected to the internet and began listening. The audio file was grainy but clear enough. It was Alden's voice, unmistakable, speaking to someone, Campbell. She realized quickly about Amanda's case. "They need a face," Alden was saying, "a fall person. The media will eat it up. Pregnant widow. There's enough drama there to distract anyone from the real numbers. As long as she keeps looking fragile, they'll never believe she's capable of orchestrating anything." "I'll do my part," Campbell replied, his tone icy. "But this is the last time. The optics are getting harder to manage." Amanda paused the recording. Her pulse was racing. She had them on record. This was more than evidence. It was a confession, proof of the collusion, of the manipulation behind her prosecution. And now, she had a decision to make. Go public and risk retaliation, or wait for the trial and drop it when it would have maximum impact. She chose the latter. Because if they wanted to use her life as a performance, She would make sure it ended on her terms, not theirs. Amanda had grown used to fear. It had accompanied her like a silent shadow, present in every decision she made, every door she locked, every time she left the house. But on that particular night, the fear didn't sit quietly in the background. It roared through her, visceral and immediate. The contraction started around 8 o'clock, sharp and sudden, more intense than the dull cramps she had felt for weeks. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on reviewing the files again, making sure she hadn't missed anything in the flash drive. But the pain came again, stronger this time, tighter. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, the breath knocked out of her. Her due date was still weeks away. She wasn't ready, not physically, not emotionally, not logistically. The nursery still lacked a crib. She hadn't packed a hospital bag. She didn't even have a car seat installed. She was supposed to have more time, but something inside her told her that time had run out. She moved slowly toward the living room, reaching for her phone to call her doctor. That was when she saw it, the envelope on the floor pushed halfway through the mail slot. The handwriting on the front was different from the previous warning. This one looked rushed, almost angry. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. David, seated at a table she didn't recognize, talking to someone, just outside the camera's frame. His face was serious, caught mid-sentence. On the back, written in thick red ink, were the words, "He didn't die by accident." Amanda's knees buckled. She sank onto the floor, the photo pressed to her chest, her mind spinning. The contractions hit again, closer together. Her water broke minutes later. The pain surged through her body with a force she hadn't expected, stealing her breath, her focus, everything but instinct. But she called 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher spoke calmly, instructing her to lie down, to breathe, to stay awake. The ambulance arrived within minutes, red and blue lights casting ghostly patterns across the walls of her home. She was wheeled out on a stretcher, neighbors peering through windows, watching as the scandalized widow was rushed into the night, her face pale, her body trembling. At the hospital, the world became a blur of lights, voices, and antiseptic smells. Nurses surrounded her, guiding her through each contraction. A doctor appeared, barking instructions, checking vitals. The baby was coming too fast. Amanda couldn't focus. Her thoughts kept drifting to the photo, to the flash drive, to the knowledge that her child was being born into a storm she hadn't yet calmed. The delivery was long, complicated by stress and exhaustion. But after hours of pushing, she heard it, a cry, shrill and perfect. A girl. The nurse placed the baby on Amanda's chest for only a moment before whisking her away to the neonatal unit. Premature. Breathing irregularities. Amanda nodded through tears, unable to speak. They named her Lily. Amanda whispered it through cracked lips, her voice barely audible. The hours that followed were quiet but heavy. Machines beeped rhythmically. In the neonatal ward, Amanda, weak and feverish, lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. She wanted to hold Lily, to smell her skin, to whisper apologies and promises. But for now, all she could do was watch from a distance, her heart breaking at the sight. She of her daughter inside a plastic incubator, tiny wires taped to her body. Langley visited that afternoon, the look on his face one of quiet panic. "You should be resting," he said, setting a file on the table, "but you need to know something." The prosecution filed a motion to accelerate the trial. It's scheduled for next week. Amanda's head turned slowly. "They're rushing it." "Yes, and the judge approved." She didn't need to ask which judge. Campbell had made his intentions clear. "I have to be there," she said. "You just gave birth." "She's not safe if I don't clear my name," Amanda said. "None of us are." Langley hesitated, then nodded. "I've seen the documents, the audio, it's real, but it's not admissible without authentication. We need someone who can connect the dots, someone who was there, a witness." "There is no one," Amanda whispered. "Everyone's scared." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "What about that philanthropist David used to meet with? The one who donated to the initiative a few years ago, Joshua Hendricks?" Amanda blinked. She hadn't thought about Hendricks in months. David had mentioned him once or twice, always with a note of caution. a wealthy investor known for supporting causes he believed in, but with a reputation for severing ties quickly, if something felt wrong. "I don't know how to reach him." "I do," Langley said, "and I think he might be watching this case more closely than you realize." Amanda nodded slowly. Her body was weak, her thoughts scattered, but the fire inside her had not dimmed. She looked at Lily again, sleeping under the soft hum of machines, and made a silent vow. They would not take her future. They would not take her child, not without a fight. The hospital room was silent except for the soft, rhythmic beeping of machines that monitored Amanda's vitals. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a faint orange glow through the blinds. Amanda hadn't slept more than an hour. Her body, still recovering from the trauma of childbirth, ached in ways she couldn't describe. But none of it compared to the weight in her chest, the unbearable pressure of knowing that time was against her and that the walls around her were closing in. Lily remained in the neonatal intensive care unit, her tiny body fighting to adapt to the world too early. Amanda had only been allowed to hold her briefly, the skin-to-skin contact brief but soul-altering. She had whispered her daughter's name like a prayer, promising silently that she would protect her, no matter what it took. That promise was why she remained awake, her mind churning with fear and strategy. The trial was only days away. The flash drive, the evidence she had, the photo, the threats. It all built a powerful case, but there was no certainty the court would even allow it to be seen. Langley had explained the legal complications: chain of custody, lack of verification, anonymous sources. In a court controlled by Judge Campbell, even the truth could be buried beneath procedure. Amanda stared at the folder resting on the chair beside her bed. Inside it was everything she had collected: the spreadsheet David had flagged, the unsigned draft of his email, the scanned documents with Richard Alden's name, and the transcribed recording from the flash drive. Each piece told a story, but together they screamed the truth that Amanda was not just innocent but targeted. It was late morning when the nurse entered. She was tall and thin, with silver-rimmed glasses, and a kind face that Amanda hadn't seen before. In her hands was a sealed envelope. "This was left at the nurse's station," she said softly, setting it on Amanda's tray table. "No name, no return address, just said it was for you." Amanda stared at the envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, with her full name handwritten in black ink across the front. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside was a single note and a small flash drive. The note read, "He trusted you. I hope you know what to do with this." An old friend. Amanda plugged the flash drive into her laptop, the screen flickering. As the contents loaded, it contained one folder, Confirmation. Inside were dozens of files, videos, audio recordings, and messages. Most were dated between 15 and 18 months ago. She clicked on one at random, a video. It showed Alden in a private meeting room, leaning across a table, speaking in a low voice to a man Amanda couldn't see clearly. "This transfer is clean. We bury it under consulting. The judge is on board. Campbell knows the schedule. The girl won't matter." Amanda covered her mouth, a sick chill crawling down her spine. The next video showed Alden and Campbell in what looked like a private lounge. Campbell was sipping from a tumbler while Alden reviewed papers. "She's still digging," Alden said. "Let her," Campbell replied. "It won't change the outcome." Amanda closed the video. The evidence was undeniable. This wasn't just corruption. It was conspiracy, calculated and deliberate. They hadn't just chosen her at random. They had decided she would be the perfect scapegoat. And now, the lies they constructed were starting to crack. Amanda knew what she had to do. She called Langley immediately. "I have something new," she said. "It's bigger than before. They were recorded, both of them." Langley drove to the hospital without delay. When he arrived, his face was pale, stunned by what Amanda showed him. "This is enough to destroy them," he whispered, scrolling through the files. This changes everything. But will the court accept it?" Langley didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Not unless someone verifies it. Someone credible, someone who knows the context and is willing to testify." Amanda's voice was hoarse. "There is no one." "There might be." Langley reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a photo. Amanda recognized the man immediately. Joshua Hendricks, wealthy investor, tech entrepreneur, and known philanthropist. He had been on the periphery of the Carolina Hope Initiative once, but she hadn't thought of him as someone who could help. David had once mentioned him with a mix of respect and wariness. He stopped working with the initiative right before David died, Langley said. No explanation, no announcement, just pulled his support. I reached out days ago, but I didn't hear back until this morning. He's agreed to meet. Amanda blinked. Why? I think he knows more than he's let on. And I think he's tired of being silent. Later that evening, Langley visited Hendricks at his private estate just outside of Charleston. The property was expansive, surrounded by high walls and private security, but the man who met him at the gate was unassuming. Hendricks was in his mid-40s, with silvering hair and clear blue eyes. He looked like someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Inside the study, Langley presented the evidence Amanda had compiled. Hendricks listened without interruption, his expression darkening with each passing minute. I warned David, Hendricks said after a long silence. He came to me, showed me part of what he'd found. I told him to walk away, that Alden was too connected. I didn't think they'd actually go that far. You knew. I suspected. I didn't have proof, but I knew Alden. We did business years ago. I saw what he was capable of. And Judge Campbell. I always wondered why Alden was so confident about the legal side. Now I know. Langley leaned forward. Will you testify? Hendricks didn't answer right away. He looked down at a framed photo of his own daughter on his desk. Yes, he said finally. Tell Amanda I'll be there. I should have done this a long time ago. When Langley returned to the hospital and told Amanda, she felt the first flicker of real hope in weeks. For the first time, someone was stepping out of the shadows, someone powerful enough to shift the balance. She looked through the glass window at Lily, sleeping peacefully now, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Amanda whispered to her daughter once more, not a promise this time, but a certainty. They're not going to win. The courthouse was already buzzing before sunrise. Satellite trucks lined the street like metal beasts, cameras mounted, reporters pacing back and forth rehearsing their lines. A few curious onlookers pressed against the barricades, hoping for a glimpse of the woman whose name had become synonymous with scandal. Amanda Sullivan had become a symbol in the public eye of betrayal, of controversy, of spectacle. The narrative had been written long before she had a chance to speak. But that morning, something felt different. The energy in the air wasn't just curiosity. It was tension, like a storm building before the first drop of rain. Reporters clutched their microphones tighter. Lawyers moved more quickly. Even the security guards, normally indifferent, scanned the crowd with sharper eyes. Amanda arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a hospital aide, her expression unreadable. She wore a simple navy dress and a light grey coat, her hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. Clutched in her hands was an envelope, thick with documents. Langley walked beside her, his posture tight, his expression somber. Inside the courthouse, the buzz grew louder as she entered the courtroom. Flashbulbs from the allowed press popped. Some whispered her name, others stared. Amanda ignored them all. Her eyes locked onto the judge's bench, where Leonard Campbell sat, expression cold and unmoving. The courtroom filled quickly. Margaret Jensen arrived with her legal team, seated with the prosecution. Richard Alden appeared shortly after, taking a seat in the gallery, again dressed immaculately, flanked by two of his ever-present companions. He looked at Amanda once, briefly, with no trace of concern. The bailiff called the court to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Leonard Campbell. The room stood. Amanda remained seated as allowed due to her condition. Campbell noted it with a small glance but said nothing. The trial had officially begun. Opening statements followed the expected script. The prosecution painted Amanda as a desperate woman who used her late husband's connections to exploit the nonprofit's resources. They cited emails, bank records, and internal documents, presenting them as irrefutable evidence of her guilt. Margaret's team reinforced the betrayal narrative. How Amanda had used grief to shield her deception. When it was Langley's turn, he stood calmly, papers in hand. His voice didn't rise, he didn't attempt drama, he simply spoke. "My client is not a criminal," he began. "She is a mother, a widow, a woman who has endured unimaginable loss and now stands accused of crimes she did not commit. This case is not about greed, it's about a system that failed her, and today we will show you exactly how and why." The prosecution presented their first witness, Margaret Jensen. She spoke clearly, confidently, describing Amanda's supposed access to financial records and how certain transactions were signed off under her name. When asked if she believed Amanda had acted alone, Margaret hesitated, then said yes, adding that Amanda had always been private and unwilling to collaborate fully. Langley cross-examined her with precision. "Did you ever personally witness Amanda authorize any financial transaction?" "No," Margaret admitted. "But did you see her access the non-profit's financial software?" "No, but her husband did, and she had access to his credentials." "Did you ever report your suspicions to the board?" She faltered. "Not officially, no." Langley nodded, letting the silence grow thick. When the second witness, a forensic accountant, attempted to verify the financial trail, Langley introduced subtle doubt by highlighting inconsistencies in the timestamps, vague metadata in the documents, and missing login credentials that made attribution questionable. The accountant admitted that while Amanda's name appeared in the records, there was no conclusive evidence that she personally initiated the transfers. Campbell didn't react, his gavel untouched. Amanda listened, to every word her heart pounding. She knew the real turning point wouldn't come from dismantling the evidence. It would come from what they were about to introduce. The materials from the flash drive and, more importantly, the witness who had agreed to appear despite the risk. On the second day of the trial, Langley requested a private sidebar with the judge. He presented the recordings, the signed verification letter from Jonah, and the transcript of David's final unsent message. Campbell reviewed the folder without expression. "This material was not submitted through discovery," he said. "We didn't have it until 2 days ago," Langley replied, "but its contents directly contradict key elements of the prosecution's case, and we have a verified chain of custody from a former employee of the Carolina Hope Initiative. Is this individual willing to testify?" "No, he's in federal protection, but we have a secondary witness, Joshua Hendricks. He's on the record, and he's here." Campbell paused. His grip on the folder tightened ever so slightly. "You understand this changes the scope of the trial?" "Yes," Langley said. "That's the point." Campbell dismissed the sidebar and called for recess. The room buzzed again as word spread that something significant had occurred. Amanda sat in silence, her pulse a constant roar in her ears. Across the courtroom, Alden had finally leaned forward in his seat, his jaw tight. For the first time since the trial began, his mask of confidence was beginning to slip. When recess ended and the court reconvened, Campbell's voice was colder than before. "The defense has introduced supplemental evidence and has called a new witness. The court will allow this testimony." The room erupted in whispers. Langley stood. "Your Honor, we call Joshua Hendricks to the stand." A door opened and a man in a dark suit entered. He was tall, composed, and quiet. He didn't look at Alden. He didn't look at Amanda. He walked directly to the stand, took the oath, and sat down. The entire courtroom leaned in as he began to speak. "I knew David Sullivan. He approached me with concerns about the Carolina Hope Initiative more than a year ago. He suspected that money was being redirected through fraudulent channels. He named Richard Alden as the source. He had documents, spreadsheets, emails. He asked for help. I declined. I told him it was too dangerous. Weeks later, he died in a car crash." Langley's voice was steady. "Did you believe that crash was an accident?" Hendricks paused. "Not anymore." The judge's gavel struck the desk once. "Order," Hendricks continued. "After his death, I severed ties with the initiative. I went quiet. I was afraid. But when I learned Amanda was being prosecuted, when I saw that the exact same documents were being used against her, I realized I had stayed silent long enough. Langley approached the bench, holding up a printed transcript. "Mr. Hendricks, have you reviewed this recording?" "I have." "Is it authentic?" "Yes." "Who is speaking in it?" "Richard Alden and Judge Leonard Campbell." The courtroom froze. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. Judge Campbell said nothing. And the storm that had been building quietly, silently, beneath months of fear and betrayal, had just begun to break. The courtroom was so still that the faint hum of the ceiling lights became audible, an eerie backdrop to the silence that followed Joshua Hendricks's declaration. No one moved. No one spoke. Judge Leonard Campbell, who had ruled over dozens of high-profile trials with mechanical confidence, sat motionless in his seat, his hand frozen above the bench as if unsure whether to strike the gavel or simply vanish. Richard Alden's face betrayed no expression, but his posture had shifted. No longer casually leaned back, he now sat forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together, eyes fixed on Hendricks like a chess player rethinking his endgame. The carefully crafted illusion of control, the one he had maintained since the beginning, was beginning to crack. Langley took a single step forward. The entire room followed his movement, journalists scribbling furiously, camera shutters clicking in rapid succession. "Mr. Hendricks," he said, "you just identified the two voices in this recording as Richard Alden and Judge Leonard Campbell. What was the context of this conversation?" Hendricks leaned forward, his voice calm and deliberate. "The conversation took place at a private club in downtown Charleston, approximately 5 weeks before Amanda Sullivan was arrested. The recording was obtained by a former associate of Alden who became disillusioned with the operation and fled the country. I received it via secure channel and verified the audio against known recordings of both men. And what were they discussing? They were finalizing the decision to frame Amanda Sullivan. The language used was clinical, detached. They referred to her as a convenient profile, someone who could carry the narrative without triggering too much legal resistance." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Amanda remained silent, her eyes locked on the man who had tried to erase her life with words and influence. Campbell's knuckles had turned white around the handle of his gavel. Langley turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a full review of this testimony and immediate protective measures for my client. Furthermore, I urge the court to suspend all current proceedings until this recording and its implications are fully investigated." For the first time in the trial, Campbell did not respond immediately. His mouth opened, then closed. He shuffled, the papers in front of him, each movement more erratic than the last. Finally, he struck the gavel, once, sharply. "Court will recess for 90 minutes. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters surged toward the door. Security personnel moved quickly to restore order, and Campbell vanished through a private exit without another word. Alden stood slowly, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked out without acknowledging anyone. Amanda sat frozen. Her body trembled with a strange combination of exhaustion and vindication. This wasn't the end, not yet, but the tide had turned. She felt it in the way people now looked at her. No longer a suspect, no longer a convenient narrative. Now they saw something else entirely, a woman who had been targeted, a woman who had fought back. Langley returned to her side. "You did it," he said softly. "Or at least you started it." Amanda nodded slowly. "He'll try something. They won't just let this fall apart." "He might try," Langley said, "but it won't matter. The media's already broadcasting Hendricks's testimony. It's too big to bury." Outside the courthouse, the air had changed. Cameramen shouted over each other, trying to be the first to report the shift in the trial. Some attempted to chase Alden's car as it pulled away, while others turned their lenses toward Amanda's. Hospital aid as she helped her back into the building. The second half of the day unfolded not in the courtroom, but in conference rooms and secure chambers. The district attorney's office sent representatives to speak with Hendricks directly. The FBI, already quietly monitoring Alden for unrelated financial misconduct, opened a parallel inquiry. Amanda and Langley were interviewed privately by federal agents. Hendricks handed over not just the flash drive, but also years of correspondence, travel logs, and documents connecting Alden to a network of shell companies and bribed officials. By the time court reconvened the following day, everything had changed. Judge Campbell did not return to the bench. Instead, a replacement federal judge entered the courtroom, a woman named Eleanor Grayson, known for her precision and unwillingness to tolerate corruption. She looked over the bench with calm authority, her presence immediate and grounding. "The court has received extensive material that directly impacts the integrity of these proceedings," she announced. "Due to the serious nature of the allegations and the depth of the evidence provided, this trial is hereby suspended, pending the outcome of a federal criminal investigation into judicial misconduct, conspiracy, and financial fraud. All charges against Amanda Sullivan are provisionally dismissed, subject to a complete clearing of her name, once the federal review is completed." Amanda closed her eyes, not in weakness, but in sheer relief. Around her, murmurs filled the courtroom, but none of it mattered. For the first time in months, the crushing weight on her chest had lifted. After the session, as people cleared the room, Amanda remained behind. Hendricks approached her, hands in his pockets. "I should have come forward earlier," he said. "David trusted me, and I stayed quiet." Amanda looked up at him, eyes tired but warm. "You came forward when it counted. That's more than most." "I want to help you now," he said. "Beyond the trial, I'm going to fund an independent audit of the initiative. Clean house, start fresh. If you're willing, I'd like you to be part of that." Amanda didn't answer right away. Her mind was still with Lily, still in that hospital room where her daughter slept under the watch of machines and nurses. But something in her shifted. Maybe for the first time, she could begin thinking about the future. "I'll consider it," she said. "But first I need to go home to my daughter." Hendricks nodded. As Amanda left the courthouse surrounded by flashing cameras, she held her head high. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a suspect or a story or a cautionary tale. She was the woman who stood up and shattered a lie that had threatened to define her. And now the world would have to see her that way too. The news of the courtroom suspension hit Charleston like a thunderclap. By mid-afternoon, it was no longer just local journalists covering the story. National media outlets began circling like hawks over a carcass that had only just started to rot in the sun. Headlines flooded every major channel. Federal judge under investigation for conspiracy and corruption. Whistleblower testimony shakes South Carolina court. Widowed mother may have been framed by financial elite. But no headline could capture the seismic shift that was happening behind closed doors. As Amanda left the courthouse under the protection of federal agents, the real unraveling had only begun. The Department of Justice initiated formal proceedings, issuing subpoenas that reached from the courtroom to boardrooms, from city officials to private foundations. By the time Amanda reached the hospital that evening, still too weak to walk without assistance, 2 black SUVs had already pulled up to the federal courthouse with sealed indictments. Lily was sleeping peacefully in her incubator. Amanda stood. Beside her, one hand on the glass, her eyes fixed on the rise and fall of her daughter's chest. For all the headlines, for all the chaos and outrage, this was the only thing that mattered. Her baby girl was safe. Her name was beginning to be cleared, and the men who had tried to destroy both were no longer untouchable. By the end of the week, Richard Alden was arrested on charges of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The evidence provided by Jonah, combined with Hendricks's sworn testimony and the materials Amanda had uncovered, painted a damning picture of a man who had spent more than a decade engineering financial schemes under the guise of philanthropy. Dozens of shell corporations, tens of millions in redirected funds, bribery, blackmail, and document forgery. And at the center of it all, the Carolina Hope Initiative, a nonprofit once praised as a model of Southern charity, now revealed as a conduit for one of the most elaborate white-collar criminal enterprises in recent state history. Alden was denied bail. 2 days later, Leonard Campbell was taken into federal custody. The footage of the judge being led out of his home in handcuffs aired on every major channel. For a man who had spent years operating above scrutiny, who had cultivated the image of moral inflexibility, the fall was nothing short of spectacular. Prosecutors announced that his assets were being frozen pending investigation and that multiple former defendants would be revisiting their sentences with new representation. Amanda watched the coverage from her hospital bed, her face unreadable. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply watched. The justice she had chased for so long was finally unfolding, not as vengeance, but as clarity. The lies were no longer protected. The systems that had ignored her had been forced to listen. Langley visited often, bringing legal updates and comfort in equal measure. With the charges dropped, Amanda was now free, though the trauma of the ordeal lingered in every part of her body. She moved through each day like someone surfacing from deep water, unsure of what the world would look like now that the tide had changed. Public opinion, too, had shifted. Those who had once stared at her with suspicion now sent letters of apology, handwritten notes, emails, even a bouquet of flowers from Mr. Dennison at the pharmacy. One message read, "We believed what we were told. We're sorry. We see you now." It didn't erase the pain, but it carved a path for healing. But Amanda's focus remained fixed on Lily. As her daughter grew stronger, so did Amanda's, resolved to protect her, not just from those who had tried to harm them, but from the shadows of their legacy. She had no interest in becoming a symbol, no desire to be the face of reform. All she wanted was the truth to remain visible, and for the people who had once acted with impunity to never again operate in silence. Joshua Hendricks followed through on his promise. Within 2 weeks, the Carolina Hope Initiative was officially dissolved. In its place, a new non-profit began to take form, with a new board of directors and a new name, the Sullivan Project. It was dedicated to supporting widows, single mothers, and women facing legal battles without access to adequate defense. Hendricks offered Amanda a leadership role. She initially declined, but after reflection and some quiet moments alone with Lily, she accepted on one condition: no press, no title, and no exploitation of her story. She worked behind the scenes, using her first-hand experience to identify the cracks in the systems that allowed people like Alden and Campbell to thrive. Her insight became invaluable. Policies were rewritten, safeguards put in place. Lawyers were recruited from universities to offer pro bono assistance. Slowly, the project began to make a difference. Meanwhile, Amanda's personal lawsuit against the city and the Federal Justice Department began to move forward. With Hendricks's legal team aiding Langley, they built a case that sought not only damages, but reforms. Amanda didn't want the money, though she knew it would help secure Lily's future. What she truly wanted was accountability, not just from individuals, but from the institutions that had failed her. It would take time. But for once, time was something Amanda finally had. In the quiet moments at home, after Lily had fallen asleep, Amanda would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the night sky. The stars above Charleston looked the same as they had months ago, but the world beneath them had changed. Not by accident, not by fate, but because one woman, cornered by corruption and abandoned by justice, refused to be silenced. The fall of the Untouchables wasn't just a collapse, it was a reckoning, and Amanda Sullivan was the one who had forced it to begin. The cemetery was quiet that morning. The sun had just begun to rise over the trees, casting long golden beams through the branches. Amanda stood alone near a modest gravestone that bore her husband's name. The grass was still damp with dew, and the air carried a weight of finality. In her arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was Lily, now nearly 3 months old, her breathing soft and rhythmic as she slept against her mother's chest. Amanda hadn't returned to this place since David's funeral. Back then, everything had felt unreal, as if the world around her had split open and swallowed her whole. But now, standing there with her daughter in her arms, the silence no longer felt like a void. It felt like a space where truth had finally taken root. She crouched down and gently placed a small bouquet of daisies at the base of the gravestone. She didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. Everything she had carried for months, the fear, the grief, the questions, had transformed into something else. Not peace, not quite, but clarity. a quiet knowing that the man buried beneath her feet had never betrayed anyone, that his death had not been in vain, that his voice, silenced by those who feared it, had been carried forward by the woman he left behind. "I kept my promise," she whispered finally. "I found the truth. I didn't let them erase you." She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. "And she'll know who you were, not the headlines, not the lies, the truth." Lily stirred slightly, then settled again. Amanda stood slowly, brushed the dew from her knees and looked around the cemetery. It was still empty, save for a groundskeeper in the distance. The city had quieted. The outrage had turned into reflection. The cameras had gone, replaced by policy meetings and investigations. The country had moved on to its next scandal, but for Amanda the story was still unfolding, not in headlines, but in every choice she made from here on. The Sullivan Project had taken root faster than anyone expected. In just a few weeks, over 100 families had reached out for legal assistance, financial advice, and emotional support. Amanda had met with a dozen of them herself, always behind the scenes, offering guidance and strategy, but avoiding the spotlight. She refused every interview, declined every podcast, turned down every book deal. Her silence wasn't shame, it was integrity. She had never wanted fame, only fairness. Her lawsuit against the Department of Justice had turned into a much larger case than anyone anticipated. What began as a claim for damages became a class action involving dozens of other plaintiffs, men and women who had faced wrongful convictions, procedural sabotage, and abuse of power under Campbell's tenure. Amanda's testimony, once dismissed as hysteria, now carried the weight of evidence and public accountability. The Federal Review Board had already begun auditing other cases, and whispers in Washington hinted at widespread reform in judicial conduct standards. Amanda didn't care for the politics of it. What mattered was that doors were finally opening for people who had once been trapped in silence. She and Lily moved out of their old house a few weeks after the trial ended. Too many ghosts, too many memories that clung to the walls like mildew. Hendricks had helped her secure a small home in a quieter part of town, close enough to the hospital and the offices of the Sullivan Project, but far enough that she could walk freely without the weight of recognition. The house was modest, but filled with light, and the nursery, once a half-painted project lost to grief, was now a space of color and warmth. Amanda spent her days balancing new motherhood with her quiet advocacy. She woke early to feed Lily, spent the mornings reviewing policy drafts and grant applications, then walked her daughter through the neighborhood in the afternoons, humming softly as the baby slept in the stroller. She met with lawyers, social workers, and survivors, people who had lived through similar nightmares and were only now finding the courage to speak. She never once called herself a hero. The people around her did often, but Amanda knew better. Heroes were people who leapt into fire, who charged forward without fear. Amanda had simply survived. She had held on to the truth when the world told her to let go. She had chosen to fight when giving in would have been easier, and she had done it for one reason: because her daughter deserved to know the world as it truly was, not as a place where the powerful always win, but as a place where ordinary people can rise, can speak, can refuse to be broken. The check from the federal settlement arrived on a rainy Wednesday. The sum was significant, more than enough to secure Lily's future, to buy a home outright, to start a college fund, to invest in the lives of others. Amanda read the letter, signed the forms, and placed them in a drawer. That money would be used carefully, not to celebrate, but to rebuild, to give back, to make sure that no other woman, no other mother would be left to fight the kind of war she had. In the months that followed, Amanda's name quietly became a touchstone in legal circles. Law students cited her case. Judges referenced her ordeal in procedural reviews. Journalists looked back at the trial as a turning point. But Amanda herself remained unseen. She became a myth to some, a memory to others. But to the people she helped, she was something simpler, real, present, steady. And every night, after Lily had been fed and changed and rocked to sleep, Amanda would step out onto her small back porch, cup of tea in hand, and look at the stars above Charleston. They no longer looked indifferent. They looked familiar, as if somehow they had witnessed everything. True justice hadn't come from the courtroom. It had come from the choice to keep going, to dig deeper, to fight without knowing if the battle could be won. And in that fight, Amanda Sullivan hadn't just survived. She had rewritten the ending. As the story closes, so too does the arc of a woman who refused to vanish, who stood in the shadow of power and chose to speak anyway. Amanda's life would never return to what it was, but in its place, she had something far more rare. A truth proven, a name cleared, a daughter safe, and a future she had reclaimed with her own hands.